Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Roski talk this evening. We are thrilled to be hearing from Kour, and we are going to have our students introduce him in just a moment. I just wanted to say hello. I am Jenny Lin, the director of the MA program in curatorial practices in the public sphere. And I wanted to also remind you to check out the Roski website and the events page for all of our exciting Roski Talks and other events that are coming up the rest of the semester and into next. I will now hand it off to Jennifer West, our MFA Art Director. Thank you, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Welcome to the Roski community. Glad to see everyone here. I just want to say a short, brief statement before the MFA and MA students introduce Kour officially. And just to say, welcome Kour. And the time that I met Kour was during a studio visit. I believe it was a speed studio visit in that it was 10 minutes when Kour was a senior at Otis in the fine art program, and just at the end of your time there about to graduate. And then sort of years later, I ran into you at an opening, I think at Blum and Poe, and you reintroduced yourself and had, been out there making work and exhibiting for a long time. So I feel like this is a full circle situation now to have you here, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have you tonight. So now I'm going to hand over the reins here to our student introducers, Jonas and Sola. Take it away.
Hi, my name is Sola Yang, and I am a first-year MFA art student. I am very honored to be here to introduce Kour today. So Kour is a British Iranian artist based in Los Angeles. He was born and grew up in Exeter, England, and moved to LA, where he received his Bachelor of Fine Art degree from Otis College of Art and Design in 2010. Kour is known for his large-scale paintings, inspired by his early memories of childhood, where he spent time in his father's Persian carpet shop, primarily working with painting and printmaking. Kour appropriates diverse forms, subject matters, and techniques from different time periods and cultures, such as Iran, Britain, Egypt, India, and China. Influenced by his multicultural family and educational background, his work explores and highlights the social and cultural connection between Western and Eastern cultures. Now, our MA cohort, Jonas, will introduce Kour's works, exhibitions, and his achievements.
Hi, as Sola said, I'm Jonas. I'm a first-year MA curation student, and it's a pleasure to be able to introduce you tonight, Kour. Represented by Kavi Gupta Gallery of Chicago, Kour attempts to deconstruct the Orientalist East-West paradigm of culture and art through the repetition of familiar forms and monumentally scaled works. Among the early pieces that propelled him to fame were large-scale paintings previously mentioned by Sola. Continuing to deal with the ever-prescient themes of othering and false cultural dichotomies, Kour's work has since begun to pivot to critical interrogations of other traditional art forms, including prints and manuscripts, with a particular emphasis placed on examining art forms historically denigrated as mere craft or decoration. In the brief decade since his graduation from Otis, work has been widely shown, with solo exhibitions being held at venues as far afield as Dublin, Berlin, Tokyo. While he has become quite well known to collectors and museums, Kour has also increasingly leveraged his fame by donating proceeds from his works to a number of charities, including the Center for Human Rights in Iran. The most notable of Kour's upcoming exhibitions is his 2022 show planned for the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, which will be his second show in that country. And without further ado, I think it's time to hand it over to Kour.
Thank you, everyone, for the introduction. So happy to be here tonight. So let me share the screen with you. Okay. Okay, welcome. So this is a picture from earlier this year in January when I became an American citizen. But in order to kind of get to the present, I need to go back a little bit and start with a brief history lesson. So this is a portrait of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was Iran's democratically elected prime minister from 1951 to 1953. He was named Man of the Year by Time in 1952, although he was described as a strange old man in the article. Mossadegh and his government were overthrown in the 1953 Iranian coup. Here are some images of protests in the streets and crowds carrying portraits of the Shah. So why did this happen? The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was founded in 1908, following the discovery of a large oil field in Iran. In 1914, the British government purchased 51% of the company. And then in 1935, the company was renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company after the Shah formally asked other countries to refer to Persia as Iran. Essentially, Mossadegh wanted to nationalize Iran's oil due to the poor deal that the Iranians were receiving from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. It turns out, though, that the British MI6 and the American CIA planned this Iranian coup to overthrow Mossadegh and replace him with the Shah of Iran, essentially gaining favor with the Shah. The American CIA have released documents acknowledging this coup. The British MI6 have yet to do the same. And in 1954, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was renamed the British Petroleum Company, also known as BP. So that takes us to 1979, the Iranian Revolution, where the Shah of Iran was overthrown and replaced by the Islamic Republic. In the same year, my father, who was 14 at the time, left Tehran with his older brother, my uncle, and moved to the UK. He didn't know English, so first studied the language, and then kind of got to work as many immigrants do, working in burger stands, eventually opening a small storefront that he kind of held several businesses in. And so the reason why I'm sharing this modern history of Iran and its involvement, and the British and American involvement in this story is for two reasons. And one is to shed light on the 53 coup, which is lesser known than the 79 revolution, and to show how this political history is tied into my own biography. So yeah, this picture here is me at age 2, I believe, in 1989 with my mum and dad. My mum and dad met at the age of 19 in Exeter. My mum was a foster child and grew up all over the UK with her sister. And so they met at 19, got married. And in my mind, or my romantic idea of the situation is the two of them were without family and wanted to create that together. And so this is a picture of us in Los Angeles. And funnily enough, you can see the BP tankers in the background. So we were here in LA for my uncle and aunt's wedding. Here's my uncle here, Mehdi, and my aunt Pam with her family. And then this is me back in the UK, in our tiny house. My parents clearly had a sense of humor with the two hookahs next to me. I grew up with two younger siblings. And this is a picture of me in my youth football team. As you can see, Exeter was not the most diverse city. So with my name and appearance, I often heard the question, where are you from? Or sometimes I would be told to go back to where I was from. So I had an interesting childhood. We celebrated Christmas. We celebrated Persian New Year. We drank English breakfast tea, and my father would burn Esfand to clear out the evil eye. So now we're going to fast forward. These are some very good friends of mine at the opening of my first exhibition in New York in 2014. Going from left to right, I suppose, we have Errol, who also works with me at my studio from the Philippines. He moved from there to Hong Kong for a couple of years and then ended up in Florida. In the back row, you have my friend Guli from Argentina. He grew up between Los Angeles and Buenos Aires. In the middle, Rashad from Iran, but moved to Germany at a very young age, as his father was a political writer. At the bottom there, we have Joey from Irvine, and on the right, Phil Kim from Chile, with his parents from Korea. So as you can see, very different from the homogeny of Exeter, where I grew up. So yeah, 2005, I moved to LA. This is LAX, which is actually not too far from my studio. So actually I'm right underneath the flight path. So I get to watch the planes come in and out every day. So I first attended Santa Monica College. This is a pretty funny picture. And that was great because I met a lot of international students who were all there from new countries, away from home. And I took a drawing class mostly because I thought it would be easy and a good place to make friends because I didn't know anyone at the time. And then through a series of coincidences and some really great mentors at SMC, I was able to transfer into Otis College of Art and Design and spent 3 years there to get my BFA. Okay, so this is probably around the time I met Jennifer. She probably saw this painting, which is the first carpet painting that I made, 4 feet by 7 feet. And essentially, I made this to kind of explore my childhood and the idea of what home meant to me. My first encounter with art was probably at my dad's rug shop, where I'd crawl around on the rugs, looking at the colors and the textures and all the shapes. So what I did for this painting was I found an image of the rug that I grew up with in our small living room and projected the image onto canvas and spent 6 months hand painting every detail. But after the 6 months, the painting sort of felt too perfect and too flat, without any texture. And so I had the idea of taking an electrical sander to the surface of the painting, which revealed the brushwork and the gesso underneath and created this antiqued and worn feeling. And in some areas I had actually sanded away too much paint. So I had to find traces of the underpainting and kind of repaint them again. And I actually remember when I was a child, my father fixing torn sections of rugs and hand inking faded areas. So it was this funny kind of return to that moment of my life. And yeah, the painting was eventually finished when the one brush that I had at the time kind of became so coarse that it no longer worked. And yeah, I had this first carpet work. So after graduating Otis, I was very lucky to get a job working for Huguette Calan. At the time, no one really knew who she was. Huguette was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and had moved to Paris later in life to pursue her career as an artist, and ultimately ended up in Los Angeles, where she befriended the cool school of Venice Beach artists, such as Ed Moses and Larry Bell. Huguette was 80 years old when I started working for her. And I would just spend my days painting in her home studio and hearing all of her stories and her experiences as a woman immigrant artist from the Middle East. This is an example of some of her earlier work, very minimal body parts, very sensual. And this is an example of the works she was focusing on at the time I was working for her, which are more inspired by tapestries and textiles. And I think that was where her and I connected. And, you know, even to this day, I sort of run my studio the way she runs her studio, which is it's very open, have friends and family coming in and out for cups of tea and to chat. So yeah, it's really just a place full of life, away from the rest of the world. This is me and Huguette in 2010, and unfortunately she passed away in 2019, which was quite hard for me to take. I kind of call her my art grandmother. But on a brighter note, at the beginning of this year, I was very lucky to hang next to her at a show curated by Shiva Balagi at the Orlando Museum of Art. And so this is Huguette's work here on the left and a painting of mine here on the right. Okay, so now we're in 2012. I think it was January. And at the time, Huguette actually had an injury and she'd fallen and broken her hip. So all of a sudden, I was out of work, and the timing couldn't have been worse, as I was also getting kicked out of my apartment for not being able to pay rent at the time. So it was kind of a disaster. But 2 days later, I got a call from Bennett Roberts, who runs Roberts Projects, formerly Roberts and Tilton. And he called to say that the gallery had had a cancellation and that they planned to have a group show the next month, and would I like to participate? I told Bennett I just lost my job, but I had started this new large carpet painting, the largest one to date that I had worked on, and that probably if I worked on it every day, I could finish it in time for the opening. So this is a large 6 by 8 foot painting. And it's the first carpet work where I included silkscreen printing. Up to that point, everything was handmade. But I was interested in the silkscreen print for both its reference to kind of a commercial way of producing an object. So with carpets, you have the hand-woven, hand-dyed rugs, and then you have the commercial side to that too. Commercial dyed, commercial kind of printed rugs. And I like the silkscreen again for the quality that it brings up close, where you can see all the pixelated imagery from the scanned rugs that I would find. So I showed this painting and got a bit of attention from that group show, and then was actually able to get my own studio. At the time, I was sharing a studio with, I think, 5 friends from Otis. We all had maybe 200 square feet each. And I was finally able to move into my own space and really focus on my work. So fast forward now to January 2014. This is my first solo show at Untitled Gallery, run by Joe Mesler and Carol Cohen. I displayed seven large-scale carpet paintings. And the rugs that I chose to paint for this show were mostly from the 17th century and were examples of carpet designs that contained patterns, symbols, and images that were the result of cultural exchange along the Silk Road. So here's one example, Dragons and Genies. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you have the genies up here in the corner, some phoenix and dragons here, and then this is the Kirin, which is a Chinese mythological creature, similar to the Kirin, the Japanese equivalent. This is Piracy. Again, in the corners, you can see these sailors, which are actually Portuguese sailors who were known for traveling and trading as far as Japan, and actually introduced Japan to tempura. That's where tempura comes from. And this is another example from the show, Hunting Along the Silk Road. And in this painting, the figures and animals depicted come from different regions of Asia. And these were all produced the same way, with hand printing and silkscreen, and then the sanding to get that texture and to erase some of the image. This is an install shot from an exhibition I was in at the Tokyo Tien Metropolitan Museum in 2017. So yeah, my interest in the rugs, apart from what I just mentioned, was also outlined in the press release for my first exhibition. And yet the reception for my work was probably not what I had hoped for. So instead of conversations around cultural exchange and the movement of objects from one place to another, and also the elements of craft and objects from outside of the West and how they may be valued differently to Western painting, for example. Instead of conversations on those things, the narrative became about my Iranian identity. And this felt like an oversimplified way to view my art, kind of an Iranian artist making Iranian paintings. And if that wasn't the conversation, then my work was sometimes described as decorative, in the negative sense, with no acknowledgement for context or historical prescience with movements such as the pattern and decoration movement, which we're now just seeing reemerge and is on the front cover of Art Forum this month, actually. So I guess all this to say that this was the kind of early mid-2010s, which was a very different moment than today. When maybe Shirin Neshat was the only Iranian artist someone could name. And I actually remember having studio visits after graduating from Otis. I had one with a curator from a museum here in LA, looking for artists to curate into a new show. And towards the end of the visit, after talking about my work and showing her the rug paintings, she kind of asked me the question, she asked me, but what is an American image? Which I felt was a total dismissal of my work and everything we had talked about up to that point. And what felt like an invitation to consider using American imagery rather than the imagery that I was using. My attitude towards that was, fuck this. you know, for me, the carpet is something that you roll up, you carry under your arm, and then you unravel when you arrive at your new destination or your new home. To me, it's the perfect kind of immigrant object or image, which for me is very American. And not to mention that the museum the curator was visiting from resides in Westwood, which is also known as Tehrangeles. So that was a very funny experience. Okay, so I get back to my studio and I realize that if I want to change this narrative around my Iranian identity, I have to find a new approach. And, you know, after all, I am mixed race. My Iranian culture is a very, very important part of me, but it's not the full picture. So I went through some books at the studio and arrived at Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And I think, you know, this is a perfect example here, this great work by Van Gogh, where you see the sitter in front of this wall covered in Japanese ukiyo-e prints, which Van Gogh collected. He had hundreds of them. So I started studying Japanese prints. I learned about the woodblock printing process. I learned about the formal elements within the imagery and prints, such as diagonal compositions, the cropping out of a scene, and the outlining, the thick kind of black outlining that you can see in portraits like this by Manet, where again, Emile Zola with this Japanese print in the background. And here Van Gogh, this kind of black outline and flat color, very much influenced by those Japanese prints. So the more I researched, the more I saw how great the Japanese influence had been on Western art, you know, from Impressionism all the way up to American abstraction, and even in a lot of contemporary painting today, actually. So I wanted to explore that cultural exchange the same way I was looking at Persian carpets that depicted the same thing. Van Gogh again making copies of paintings and even adding Japanese text to the side of the works. And this is actually a great example. So while I was in Tokyo for my museum show, at the Metropolitan Museum, they had an exhibition of Van Gogh with Japanese ukiyo-e prints. And so this work here on the left is a painting of his, and you can see that he's grabbed this image of the geisha, which comes from the Japanese print and then is presented in this magazine in 1886. He then makes the painting in 1887, a year later. Here, again, you see on the left-hand side, the two birds, the storks, which appear on the left-hand side of the image in the border. And then at the bottom of the painting is this frog or toad, which is on the right-hand side in this Japanese print. So essentially, I think of Van Gogh as sort of an early appropriation artist, much like what the artists in the 80s and picture generation artists were doing. So I started exploring Japanese printmaking myself in my own work. And I learned how to make block prints, which is sort of a hard process to explain. I have videos later on in the slides, so you'll be able to see how it works. But essentially, you take an image. So this painting here is a cropped section of this Yoshitoshi print, where I've taken kind of the midriff where the armor and the patterning from the fabric on what he's wearing. And I've abstracted that and drawn that image onto a vinyl block. That block is then carved, and then ink is rolled onto the block and then printed onto the canvas. And this happens several times, one block for each color. And so this is me exploring abstraction with the direct link to Japanese art. This is from a Kuniyoshi print. Partially for the same reason, I really love the textile and the patterning, but I also love these zips. And with the composition that I made, it kind of reminds me of futurist painting. Here's another example. This is 2018, so I think this is definitely a response to the California wildfires that we've had over the past several years. And then I start going into landscape and abstraction. Landscape was, of course, a big theme in Impressionism. And so in these works, I'm doing the same, cropping from Japanese landscape prints and then playing with color and shape. These two are, again, from Japanese prints. These three works are actually cropped sections from Persian miniature painting. And what happens here is, in Persian miniature painting, there is influence from East Asia, from Japan and China. So these works here really remind me of Chinese landscape painting. And here's another installation shot of three works from the same series. So at this point, I'm getting deeper into abstraction and the history of abstraction. And so I start this project, which, to further push my point about cultural exchange and to probably set a few records straight, I created a zine. And so I purchased this 2013 catalog from the 2012 show that MoMA produced called Inventing Abstraction, 1910 to 1925. This is some scanned images from my zine. So as you can see on the left, I have titled the book Reinventing Abstraction. I've scribbled out the date. And I've started making annotations and notes to the text in the book. And then following these corrections to the text, I would find images, cut and paste them next to the works from the exhibition. So here you see geometric abstraction alongside Islamic tile design. This page is full of both paintings by Malevich and Indian tantric painting, to the point where I actually don't necessarily remember which one is which. Here, Zen painting and Franz Klein abstraction, they basically look identical. And here we have Persian miniature painting alongside the likes of Frank Stella. So essentially my issue with this show and the language of the show was that abstraction was invented in the West after 1910 and that nothing like it had come before, which is obviously incorrect. This takes me to another series of paintings geometric miniatures, which continues this conversation around cultural exchange and modernism's extraction of other cultures' art histories. And essentially, I believe that modernism got rid of any indication of pattern, ornament, and cultural signifier to create a new form in art. So therefore, modernism can be seen as a record, not of new form and invention in Western art, as it's been written about and taught at art school, but instead the record of Western colonial power that is, built upon the labor and resources from places like the Middle East, Asia, Africa, South America. So with much of my work, I'm reinserting images and patterns and any sort of reference that may have been eradicated, like these geometric miniature paintings. And so let's just go through a few of them. The images are taken from the Shahnameh, which is a Iranian epic, and I have scanned those images, silkscreened them onto canvas, and then painted out sections of the text or architectural elements in the painting to kind of create this dialogue. And this is kind of a development on that series where, rather than erasing portions of the scene in text with flat geometric shapes, I've literally cut out the image, again, kind of mirroring modernism's extraction from non-Western cultures. So these are made in the studio. We kind of cut out the panels and then print the image again with silkscreen. And so, these shaped canvases echo visual languages from mid-century American painting, Frank Stella, Kenneth Nolan, Ellsworth Kelly, and then, the muted colors and low contrast printing perhaps lend themselves to minimalism. There's Ellsworth Kelly. So this is actually a sneak peek of a work for my upcoming show in New York. This is an architectural fragment as a painting that has been extracted from this work here. So if you can see, the archway in the scene is taken and then made into a kind of quasi life-sized painting. And the plan is to eventually build many of these and exhibit them together to kind of create an environment where one could experience the landscape of one of these miniature paintings. And I believe the next image, so that is actually a block printed work. So in this video, you're going to be able to see how the process works. So let me hit play. And then I'm going to take you, to the next series of work. So this is from my latest series of Tiger works. And here you're going to see us rolling the ink onto the carved block. So that block is a vinyl material. And we use these carving knives to, everything that you kind of see in white is carved out. So therefore the ink, that's the negative space, so the ink doesn't stick to those sections. and then basically we'll print the positive, which you'll see here. And, you know, I think what I really love about this process is how the ink transfers from one surface to another, almost mimicking, you know, the transfer of cultures. And this also correlates with the history of printmaking and how information and images are disseminated, and how they transform along the way. Okay, so this is a photo of Phil Kim, who was in the earlier photograph from my New York opening in 2014. And this is kind of a classic example of how something personal enters into my work or my studio. So, you know, this is a tiger tattoo, a Korean tiger image tattooed to his belly. Phil and I met back at Santa Monica College. Phil is Korean, but he was born and raised in Chile before moving to LA. I believe he was around 18 or 19 when he moved here. So we met in school. We both got art degrees, and ended up sharing a studio together. Phil, like me, is the eldest brother in a family of immigrants. He and I share many of the same experiences moving here, even though we come from two very different cultural backgrounds. And we would find ourselves in these funny situations where we would go to a Mexican restaurant and the waiter or waitress would often come up to me and ask me something in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, but Phil would turn and reply to them in Spanish, obviously being from Chile. And, you know, this would kind of confuse the waiter or waitress and we would laugh. But this confusion, I think, for Phil and I was very real and authentic to our experience of moving here to the US. So, like I said, Phil and I shared a studio together after art school. Eventually, Phil took up tattooing and became very popular and started traveling and working all over the place. And so, you know, I moved into my own studio and we didn't get to spend as much time together anymore. And so I probably just missed him. And this tiger image just stuck with me. So I brought it back into the studio and I started research, which is what I do with all my other bodies of work. And I learned about this tiger image and how it comes up in painting it from many different cultures. So Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Tibetan, you can find it in Persian art, even in Russian printmaking too. So, you know, these three images are a good example of this kind of back and forth between China, Korea, and Japan, actually. And on the right, you have this small illustration from a Chinese medical book, and then an ink painting on paper in the middle, and to the left, 18th century scroll from Japan. And you can see that the compositions or the stances of the tigers are almost identical, but they've all been rendered slightly differently. And in the rendering, you can basically guess where a tiger image was painted, although it's not very clear. Oftentimes, there is information on these works, the artists are unknown, and so it gives experts kind of a run for their money in guessing the origins of these tiger images, which I think is part of the interest for me in these works. These are two images from Korean Minhwa, which is the folk art tradition. Again, very similar in composition and stance to the previous slide. So on the left, so they're both apparently Korean images. However, on the left, you'll see that the fur is rendered almost more naturally, which would indicate that it's possibly copied from a Chinese image, whereas the painting on the right is more stylized with the expression more exaggerated, which indicates that it's painted more in the tradition of Korean Minhwa painting. So I took these two images and reproduced them as block prints on Japanese kozo paper. This is actually, one of these is from the video that I just showed. And I special ordered this paper from Japan and decided to execute the works in black and white, so you could clearly see the formal differences and similarities between the two works. This is an installation shot from my show at Kavi Gupta. There are 12 works here, all picked for their individual expressions and character. I kind of thought of them as a family, you know, where you have different members. Everyone has their own personality. So this one is Modernism is Cute, block printing ink and oil on canvas. So what you're seeing in black is ink printed on canvas, which is the tiger image. And then once the painting is stretched, on top of the print, I'm kind of extracting stripes or vegetation or even an eye from the tiger, redrawing them and then rendering the shapes in oil paint, essentially abstracting the image. Here are two more examples. So essentially what happens here is you get into a conversation with the likes of Calder and Miro. And again, I'm relating Western modernism to its roots in Asian painting. Here's another large scale work from the same show at Kavi Gupta. This one I really loved because you had these big swatches of color, this green, yellow, red, and blue, that really made me think of color field painting. And then because the painting is so large up close, those spots really become abstracted, and you know, you're looking at little stripes of white and painted areas. So the image really falls apart at this large scale. And to finish, this is my dog Huxley and another Korean tiger painting. And that is it. Thank you very much.
That's a great place to end.
Yeah, he looks pretty scruffy there.
So people are welcome to ask questions of Kour. You can put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. I'm just going to scroll through. I see some great comments, but looking for some questions. You know, I was really struck just by the multicultural nature of what you showed. And I related to a lot of it as a South Asian American myself, with, like you, I think, a real fondness for art history. I wonder if you might unshare just so that we can see you bigger, and then we'll converse a little bit. The question that I wanted to kick us off with is about the idea of a third culture. So we often hear this kind of referred to when you're mixed race or when you're mixed culture, that you occupy a third cultural space. It doesn't necessarily have to be that, right? It can also be because you grew up in a culture that was different than that of your parents. Do you imagine your work to represent third culture in a sense? And in that vein, do you think that that's something that's a 20th century phenomenon, or do you think that that's actually a phenomenon that goes back sometime?
Sure. So actually, the term third culture comes from an anthropologist couple who, I think this was in the 50s, from America, went to, I believe, India to study Americans living over there. The husband studied the adults and the wife studied the children. And this is where the third culture term comes up. So the first culture is the home culture. So in this case, that would be the United States. The second culture was India. I don't remember where in India they were staying. And then the third culture was her way of describing how a child navigates the new home coming from the original. So, also, like you said, it was originally kind of used for kids growing up with parents that would travel and work. But I think as the term became a bit more popular, others related to it, such as immigrants and refugees, mixed race children who are adopted, people that have left different cities. So while the term is indeed from the 20th century, I would argue that this is a much older concept, and probably part of my interest in looking at historical images is to understand how we arrive to the moment today.
Thank you. So we have some questions about your technique with printmaking specifically. Yeltsin is asking, do you print your blocks by hand or do you use a press? And can you tell us a little bit more about the technique, say in those larger prints that we saw you pulling in the videos?
Yeah, sure. So they are printed by hand. So you could see Errol, my assistant, and I, again, we roll the ink, drop the canvas down onto the block, and then we have these, 6-inch barons, something that looks like this, they're padded, and we apply pressure to the back of the canvas, and then we peel the canvas up from that block, and the ink transfers from one surface to the other. Typically, you do this on paper with a press, small scale, but at such a large scale, this was the way we designed to make the works. And what's quite cool is that you get different textures because of we have to crawl on the back of the painting, so you can see kind of palms and knees and feet and occasionally Huxley paw prints on the back of the painting when he tries to help out.
And then what another person here asks, how can we see your work in person? Is there any opportunity to see your work in LA?
Not in LA currently, although I do have a studio here. So, maybe if you reach out to me, you can come to the studio. Otherwise, I have a show opening November 11th in New York at Shrine. And then I believe the show after that will be in London next March.
Do you have any works in LA collections?
Yes, but nothing on view currently.
But are there museum collections you can share with us just so we can bother them until they put your work up?
No museum collections in LA.
Okay, well, then I guess we should bother them until they buy your work.
We should, yeah, exactly.
Great. Any more questions? Okay, yes. Jeannie Dunn says, do you see your work raising viewers' awareness of interconnectedness across viewers' cultural heritages?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, she says, do you see your work raising viewers' awareness of interconnectedness across viewers' cultural heritages?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's another important discussion for me, where, for example, looking at Persian miniature painting, to acknowledge that that genre of painting is influenced by, East Asian painting as well as European. so that this idea of something being Persian or Iranian it kind of simplifies or erases some of the history of how we get to that point. So yeah, to always question the origin of something, including our own identities.
Great. So one of our graduate students, Kim, has got a great question in the chat here. So Kim, I've given you speaking privilege. Would you please unmute yourself and ask your question of Kour?
Can you ask it? Because I can't find it. I wrote it in the text, so thank you. But it was very important to me because the history of my work and my background is very much about being a decorative artist. So thank you.
Yes, so the question was, can you talk about how you recovered emotionally from the pejorative of being called decorative? Your work developed from that criticism, but you still held on to the decorative aspect in your work. I think holding on to this practice, part of your practice, was essential. So maybe this is a good opportunity to dig in a little bit deeper to some of the veiled cultural associations that are impregnated in the pejorative of decorative when we talk about painting.
Right, yeah. That's a great question. You know, it probably just pissed me off. And that probably, you know, lit a fire under my arse. And, you know, I actually really enjoy what happened because I think it did push me further and made me think about how I can communicate these ideas in a clearer way or in a variety of ways. You know, again, we're just seeing, we had this pattern decorative show at MoCA in, I think, was that 2019 or 2020? And, you know, probably for similar reasons, that movement was sort of ignored because the work was decorative, based in craft, feminine, and, you know, used all these references from other cultures that minimalism and, you know, modern art had basically erased. So yeah, I was pissed off. It was obviously frustrating at the time, but you know, you just have to keep going, I suppose. And sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Oh, no, I think that was great. I'm actually going to move on maybe to Jenny's question. Jenny, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that talk. It was really, really wonderful to see your work and your really important perspective on global art history. I want to talk to you more about how you would teach a survey class. I wanted to ask you if you think that the way you developed your work after the initial kind of very reductive criticism that you were making Iranian art by an Iranian artist, and then you developed it to focus on these cross-cultural exchanges. And I'm wondering if you feel like that was successful in terms of evading those earlier criticisms. And furthermore, do you feel like there's a danger of the potential for those criticisms to get kind of replaced by a similarly simplistic reading that might be like, oh, this is about East meets West and mixed cultures by a mixed race artist, and how you tackle that? And I personally think that the way that you're talking about the use of materials and specifically woodblock prints functioning like cultural exchange really kind of complicates that narrative. And yeah, just an observation. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, that was a lot. Let's see. So, you know, hopefully the conversation is clearer now, because I always thought that I was making work about cross-cultural exchange. It just wasn't read that way. Again, once you put something out into the world, you don't get to control it. And that's happened a couple of times. Obviously, when I started making paintings that referenced Japanese art, for example, people would ask, why are you doing that? You're not Japanese. And, you know, depending on my mood that day, I would respond in a variety of ways. You know, would you ask me the same question if I was an artist from a different background? You know, why am I only allowed to make Iranian art with my Iranian identity when other artists can make what they want and are not questioned for making it? So part of this is like a fight for, you know, freedom, in the sense of, why does my work have to be attached to my identity? And while I understand that was the case with the carpet paintings, if, you know, another artist made those works from a different background, the narrative would not be the same. So, you know, it's just to ask those questions, to make people think about their responses to artwork. In a way, I feel like my studio has almost been a research center where, you know, it's great being by LAX because people literally from all over will stop, you know, their first stop will be at the studio or the last stop will be there. So I get people from all over, and I can start kind of collecting data based on what people are responding to and where they're from, what their cultural background is. So again, you know, I can't control what the outside world thinks, but hopefully with, you know, the more work that I make, and possibly creating this sort of confusion, because I think a lot of people are not necessarily aware of all the different bodies of work that I make, that there comes an understanding of what I'm essentially getting at.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Jennifer has a question about your zine and your research process.
Yes.
Hi, Kour. Thank you so much for the talk today. It was great to just see the full trajectory of your work and to understand it from, I think, our initial conversation that we had in your studio when you were making probably the beginnings of your carpet pieces at that time. So my question is, seeing how you've gotten so interested in research as you've, you know, progressed in your practice and really looking specifically at this cultural exchange, if you could talk about your research process and how you conduct the research, you know, sort of like what source process do you go through? Do you use books or using the internet and so forth? And have you done research in other countries when you visited them for exhibitions? And then the second part was, I was really curious as a zine maker myself about your zine project and how your zine project kind of brought together your ideas in this different way. And I always think of zines as this ability to kind of self-publish, right? And to be able to get your word out to an audience in a really different way. And if those zines were done in multiples, and did you sell them or give them away, or how did those function within your exhibition?
Yeah, so, you know, the zine, you're absolutely right. The zine is, you know, traditionally this tool that you use to spread information. I had them printed for a show at the beginning of 2017, I believe, was the first time I published them. And they were at the front of the gallery. You could just grab one. I believe I still have a few copies of that original print. And, you know, I think people did respond to it differently because it's this kind of raw, you know, it's not precious. It's playful. It's a little cheeky. And I was, you know, it communicates very directly, whereas maybe with my work, it can be more formal, or perhaps, you know, it's more poetic. It's not so cutthroat. So yeah, and you know, the plan is, this is a big catalog. It's quite thick, a few hundred pages. The plan is to eventually go through the whole catalog and then reproduce it in the same format as the MoMA catalog, and then to hopefully have that at the bookstore next to the MoMA catalog. But for the time being, the zine, you know, gets the project out there perhaps I'll make a few versions of the scene once I complete more pages. And then in terms of research, you know, obviously with this project, it was, you know, starting with the book and reading the texts from people like Glenn Lowry, who was the director of MoMA and was actually, you know, he started at MoMA as a Islamic art specialist. So to see him write that abstraction was invented in 1910 to 1925 was kind of shocking, actually, when he clearly has access to the history of Islamic art. And then, you know, you start making connections. So you look at how MoMA treat abstraction and modern art, and then you look at, you know, the British and American governments and the CIA and the MI6 in Iran kind of extracting their resources. So, you know, you can make these connections. Then my own biography, being Iranian and British and then coming to the United States. And so, yeah, books, of course, the internet's not always reliable, especially when I'm searching for things like some of these Korean tiger images, because the artists are unknown. I have a little catalog of Myanmar at my studio, and even in that book, there's no reference. There's no information about the images. It's just the image. So some of the stuff's really hard to find. I've been, you know, I didn't get the opportunity to show everything in my studio tonight. There are other bodies of work, and I do paper making, and there's this collage tradition from Japan called Tsujigami. I have one book, it's in Japanese. Next time I go to Japan, I will take it with me and have my friends translate it. But yeah, it's actually quite hard to do some of the research. But going to, you know, luckily enough, I've been able to travel to Japan and saw this Van Gogh exhibition. So that obviously informed, you know, some of the talk tonight, for example.
We've got a couple more questions left. Jennifer, do you have a follow-up? Sorry.
No, I just said thank you.
We probably want to wrap in about 5 minutes just to let the audience know. Of course, if you have a burning question, please don't hold back. So Sal asks, is there a particular audience in your mind that you work for?
You know, I mean, it's definitely for others like myself, but then it's also for people who don't have this experience, because, you know, you want them to understand too. But look, yeah, I definitely, you know, a lot of my friends and loved ones here are immigrants and have this experience of exchange, and that's not necessarily on purpose, that's just naturally how it works. It's a little harder to name that audience because that isn't necessarily language. You used third culture earlier, so sure. But, you know, again, you want people who are not familiar with this experience to understand where you're coming from.
And then the last, I'm going to combine the last two questions into one,
Mm-hmm.
so the question is sort of 2 or 3 part, which is, do you think that you were also exploring Persian culture yourself initially when you were working with rugs, given that you haven't lived in Iran yourself, and that you would have ultimately gotten to the works you're making through making those works? And then to that point, how do people read your work in Iran, and is it different from how it's understood and received here?
Yeah, I definitely, you know, thinking of my childhood. So when I was growing up in England, you know, my dad had his day job and then he drove trucks at nighttime. So he wasn't around a whole lot, didn't teach me and my siblings Farsi. He didn't really have anyone to speak Farsi with. I don't think it was really encouraged. I think if he did speak Farsi, he was told not to speak that, you know, foreign muck. And yeah, I didn't grow up in Iran. I've never been able to visit Iran. So absolutely, it was, you know, an exploration into the culture. And I was able to do that through making these artworks. And then as far as the reception in Iran, I'm not entirely sure. I have spoken to curators and gallery owners over there, but I've not actually exhibited in Iran as of yet. So we'll find out, I suppose.
Great. Well, I think that we have answered all of the questions. So I think we'll call it a night. This has been an amazing talk. There are many comments in the chat about how powerful your words have been and how meaningful it's been for the many people who have been listening. And I just want to also echo that. It's been really quite a wonderful talk. So thank you so much for your words and for your work. And we're so excited to have you with us tomorrow to meet the graduate students.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to meeting everyone tomorrow. And I have to say thank you to Katya, who helped me with this presentation. So there you go.
Great. Well, thanks again. Any last words from Jennifer or Jenny?
Just thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
tonight. It was great. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And we look forward to bring your zine to the studios.
Okay, I'll bring a few copies if I wake up early enough. I'll start first.
Yeah. And before you end it, just check out, you're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat if you
How
want
do I do
to.
this chat?
You can save, why don't you save the chat, in the 3 dots on the right.
Oh, cool.
I
And
can
then-
send it to you after the recording is processed too, if you'd like.
Oh, thank you. Oh, this is great. Thanks, everyone.
All right, terrific. Well, have a wonderful night, everybody.
Bye.
For the Roski
Thank
Talk
you.
next Tuesday. And yeah, be safe out there. Bye.